All right, so we're officially live. Wanted to welcome everybody today. This is a really exciting opportunity. We're being joined by Douglas Lain from Zero Books and Zero Squared Podcast. A couple words, we're going to say a few words about the sponsoring organizations really quick. First, a couple of the people here found out about us through an organizational meeting we were for the DSA at Boise State that was hosted by the NSO, a group, the New Symbolic Order, which is an up-and-coming student organization that is trying to think of a world, a post-capitalist realist world. And we are the Turtle Island Research Cooperative, physically located in Boise, Idaho at the center of Victory Farm. Our mission is to research, practice, and promote monastic-inspired living learning communities that create a critical space for the cultivation of intellectual, artistic, and ecological well-being. Our vision is to inspire the increasing number of folks realizing well-being and surplus time energy are more valuable than profit, that wealth should not be judged by monetary worth, but by intellectual, artistic, and critical engagement in ecological communities. We routinely host seminars, workshops, salons, and potlucks to build community and spaces for critical discourse. Recently, we read Mark Fisher's Capitalist Realism, in which Fisher argues that increasing environmental devastation, bureaucracy, and mental illness sign the untenable nature of the current political and economic paradigm. And then before welcoming Douglas Lain to speak, we were going to have Sammy read this. We were like, is it a mission? It's a statement from the publishers.
Yeah, I guess kind of a mission statement from Zero Books at the back of, I think, every one of their books. Contemporary culture has eliminated both the concept of the public and the figure of the intellectual. Former public spaces, both physical and cultural, are now either derelict or colonized by advertising. A cretinous anti-intellectualism presides, chilled by expensively educated hacks in the pay of multinational corporations who reassure their bored readers that there's no need to rouse themselves from their inner passive stupor. The informal censorship, internalized and propagated by the cultural workers of late capitalism, generates a banal conformity that the propaganda chiefs of Stalinism could only have dreamt of imposing. Zero Books knows that another kind of discourse, intellectual without being academic, popular without being populist, is not only possible, it is already flourishing in the regions beyond the striplet malls of so-called mass media and the neurotically bureaucratic halls of the academy. Zero is committed to the idea of publishing as a making public of the intellectual. It is convinced that in the unthinking, blandly consensual culture in which we live, critical and engaged theoretical reflection is more important than ever before.
Please put your hands together and welcome Douglas Lain.
Well, you know, it's appropriate that you should read that mission statement at the start, because I believe Mark Fisher had a hand in writing that. I'm not exactly sure who was most responsible, but Mark Fisher was the editor. He was a major force behind Zero Books. 2014, and I started in 2015 at Zero Books after the original crew had left. So I want to point out two things. One is that, well, I'm glad to be here today to talk about Mark Fisher and his work. I'm not the man responsible for publishing it, and was not close to him when he was alive. I had talked to him a few times. He was a very good guest on a podcast I did called Diet Soap, and I thought he was a swell guy and a very intelligent leftist. But I would encourage you to reach out to people at Repeater Books as well as to me to discuss Mark Fisher's work, because they knew him quite well and personally. So I just wanted to say that. But I'm very glad to talk about his book, because even it continues to be, this book continues to be definitive for Zero Books. It's a definitive book for us. It's what we sort of set sail by. So I have this paper, and I'll just read a little bit from it here. I'll read the whole thing, hopefully. So, capitalist realism. While the term might have originally been a pejorative description of pop art, and it's a particularly good way to describe works by Jeff Koons or Damien Hirst, basketball submerged in a fish tank as perhaps definitively capitalist realist. He was a supposedly conceptual artist who stripped away all ideas and left us nothing but a pure commodity form to think about. Still, capitalist realism, when deployed by Mark Fisher, is more than a description of hack work by self-congratulatory artist investors. And he wrote, his use of the term than most people thought, or most people wouldn't use it in the expansive way he did. Quote, capitalist realism, as I understand it, cannot be confined to art or to the quasi-propagandistic way in which advertising functions. It is more like a pervasive atmosphere, conditioning not only the production of culture, but also the regulation of work and education, and acting as a kind of invisible barrier constraining thought and action. In many ways, I think Fisher is echoing the French radical Guy Debord. Capitalist realism explains why the world hasn't changed. It explains the way capitalist culture paralyzes us as we're atomized, as we're separated both from each other and from our own creative powers. And Debord's notion of the spectacle explained these same things, these same processes, back in 1967. Debord wrote that the spectacle, grasped in its totality, is both the result and the project of the existing mode of production. It is not a supplement to the real world, an additional decoration. It is the heart of the unrealism of the real society. And in all its specific forms, as information or propaganda, as advertisement or direct entertainment consumption, the spectacle is the present model of socially dominant life. It is the omnipresent affirmation of the choice already made in production and its corollary consumption. The spectacle's form and content are identically the total justification of the existing system's conditions and goals. There's also the permanent presence of this justification, since it occupies the main part of the time lived outside of modern production. So that's the end of the quote. But as much as Fisher and Debord sound alike, Fisher's theory could only develop after Debord's approach to politics had failed, after '68, and after the '80s, even after neoliberalism. Debord conceived of his theory of the spectacle as a weapon that he was putting into the hands of the proletariat, as a tool to be used in battle. In his 1988 follow-up to his book, Society of the Spectacle, a work called Comments on the Society of the Spectacle, Debord wrote that his comments are sure to be promptly known by 50 or 60 people. A large number would be people who he wanted to talk to, and many would be people who he didn't want to talk to, and that he was thereby constrained in what he could say. He could not speak in complete freedom. He had to take care not to instruct just anybody. So understanding Debord's theory of the spectacle, you have to understand it in the context of a battle, of a war. Debord thought that his ideas could have profound consequences. Fisher, on the other hand, was more modest, and strangely, despite his rejection of Marxism proper and his embrace of electoral approaches to politics, and many forget that Fisher's controversial Vampire Castle essay was as much about utopian anarchism as it was about what later became known as social justice warriors. Still is more radical than Debord is today, not in intention, but in his critique. It's more relevant to us. Influenced as Fisher was by Slavoj Žižek, his understanding of the 2008 crisis, the economic crisis, didn't embrace conspiracy theories the way many pro-situationist authors did. And he didn't think that capitalist realism was a conscious political project orchestrated by elites, but felt that it was more like a psychological symptom of how the global order on both the right and the left could not take up the truth of the current moment. Deflection and fetishistic disavowal afflicted both the masses and the politicians, according to Fisher. And he wrote that the centerlessness of global capitalism is radically unthinkable. In other words, there was no political center to the crisis of 2008, no political center to the ongoing crisis that is defined, like the last 20 years or more. What Fisher is doing in his book, Capitalist Realism, is challenging us to think again, to dare us to make radical demands and pursue radical activity aimed at changing the structure of society. He conceives of this structure as being cultural and or ideological, but even so, his theory leaves open the possibility that we need to tackle capitalism itself, if only because his term includes the word capital or capitalism, and he does not suggest that capitalism has become something else than what it is, or something new, like a spectacle. Okay, and then a couple more comments here. I have some problems with how Fisher substitutes neoliberalism for capitalism in his book, or how the target of revolutionaries becomes this managerial project rather than the structure or system of capitalism itself at times. A system that requires a never-ending process of innovation in terms of management. So we're kind of pushing on an open door when we go after neoliberalism. And it's worth noting how anti-neoliberalism after 2009 led to an embrace of Syriza and some confusion about Trump on the left. However, Fisher's insistence that we return to labor politics, that we return to making demands about how we work, still resonates for me, and frustratingly, it still remains an untested suggestion. Finally, I'm just going to say something about the final lines of the book. Imagine reading those final lines of Capitalist Realism in the fall of 2011, after the Arab Spring had toppled Mubarak in Egypt and before Zuccotti Park had been cleared of camping protesters. How would you have interpreted Fisher's assertion that the very oppressive pervasiveness of capitalist realism means that even glimmers of alternative political and economic possibilities can have a disproportionately great effect? The tiniest event can tear a hole in the gray curtain of reaction of possibility under capitalist realism. From a situation in which nothing can happen, suddenly anything is possible again. How true does this declaration sound to us today, I wonder? And can we make it sound true again? Okay, so those are my comments on Fisher's Capitalist Realism. I hope that it was audible.
Thank you. Normally we have, it seems like normally we have a few more people joining by the internet and a few less people joining in the room.
Right.
We found out today that we need a bigger place.
But I can see all of you guys.
No, you can't. You can't see Rascal in the middle of the table, or Andrew or Bert, but you see the rest of us. Rascal's a cat, by the way. So I guess from here we can just kind of do kind of a Q&A and more informal conversation.
Yeah, just a conversation.
So, I mean, we could start with your last...
I've read and... Go ahead, yeah.
Oh, I was going to say we could start with your last question, that does that seem true to us today, that the tiniest event could sort of tear this sort of hole in social reality? Or does it seem a little bit more overwhelming at this point?
Well,
think such flux now, you can't tell what the end state will be. It's all up for grabs in a way it hasn't been since late 60s. if then.
I kind of feel like after Trump, this desire for any kind of disruption at all maybe needs to be questioned, you know, because he ran as a disruption, surprising, I guess, even himself with his victory.
Mm-hmm.
And
yes,
and so I feel like we need to be a little bit more ambitious and concrete about what we want, rather than just, you know, wholly negative. Well, obviously, a negative critique of what exists is necessary, but like I always go on and on about how we need to think about what we want to see after a change, after what is gets disrupted.
You know, one of the things about these uprisings that have happened, the Arab Spring and what we saw with Occupy Wall Street, there is this kind of process of contagion, and sometimes that unfolding process of this sort of contagion that is kind of subversive of the system as it is, it can topple governments. But it just seems that these old structures that we're so used to, you know, they can survive that kind of episodic revolt, and they seem to recongeal. Right. Sometimes, and actually they mutate into even a more firm and lasting version of themselves, thanks to this, that they've been contested. It really echoes with me, resonates with me rather, that what are we going to replace it with? And I'm just wondering about your thoughts of the relationship between the spontaneity of a lot of these, let's call them uprisings or resistances, and an actual plan to create an alternative social order. Wow, that just seems a lot harder than just rising up.
Yeah. Well, I'll just add, I mean, I kind of agree with you. And I'll just add that we've seen uprisings again and again. It seems to be part of the process, part of regular politics, to have mass protests and uprisings and coups. And what we have a much more difficult time with on the left, I think, is thinking together. We can get out on the street together. We can fight together, but it's very difficult, I feel like, especially now, but it has been for a long time, to think together. That's part of the project that Zero Books is all about. I mean, that's why we exist in a way. But I think it's very easy to find a niche or a way of thinking that becomes profitable or at least sustainable, and to stay there and not to have your presumptions challenged, and not to really face when you have gaps in your own theory or your own approach. So it seems like we're very good in this society of innovating technologically and innovating in terms of even political structures sometimes, or management structures. That those at least come along after innovative technological change. But we have difficulty innovating on the left, or innovating critique, or just, you know, creative critique. And I don't even know what that is exactly, but it seems like that's what's necessary today. But when you find it, it's usually the first approach, or, you know, first attempts at creative critique, or suggesting an alternative model, is unpalatable. It's just usually, it's very easy to poke holes in. And I think we should accept that as part of the process. Like, you guys, are you aware of Paracon as a alternative to capitalism?
No.
Okay, I'm not. Paracon is an economic model developed by one of the editors of Z Magazine. I forget his name now, and I've only sort of read a bit about it, but his idea was that a computer algorithm would assign people jobs in the new economy, and that there wouldn't be a profit motive in production, but it would be decided by a computer when people should work based on what people wanted to produce. In other words, you'd have a council meeting, people would democratically decide what needed to be produced or what kinds of work needed to be done, and then you would just be assigned certain tasks based on, I don't know, maybe testing scores or how much work you'd already accrued by an algorithm. And this would replace the capitalist mode of production. It's kind of dystopic. You know, if you, you wake up every morning, Facebook or computer says, you need to go report to the sewage treatment plant today. It's not exactly a socialist dream, but it is getting at the kind of changes that we need to see if we really wanted to escape from capitalist economics, capitalist production.
Well, I mean, imagine if you had.
I just put that out there. Go ahead.
Imagine if you had all the benefits of a full-time, middle income sort of career, but you're only working part-time, through an app. So it's like you could, well, what kind of work is needed this week? What kind of training have I already taken? I'm able to either go rake these leaves or, do some accounting for somebody or something. I don't know.
Akin to like Uber, where it sends you like a notification if there are any jobs in the area, and depending on how much work you've done this week or would like to do, they request you to go do that work, and so you go and do that work regardless of what it is.
Everybody's conveniently fungible.
I mean, this is what happens. You start to try to imagine an alternative to capitalism, and you realize capitalism is already on its way in that direction. So your vision of socialism is actually just capitalism's vision of, ultimate precarity, and so being a farmer in the morning and a poet in the afternoon, as Marx imagined, is resold to you as being an Uber driver, in the morning, and being a temporary college professor in the afternoon, and so on.
That would be great if you didn't have to do it to survive. I mean, I would enjoy doing. That's kind of how I don't have a full-time job. I just patchwork together 3 or 4 different things, and it's not that I don't dislike doing it. It just sucks to feel all that anxiety about I have to find more things. You always have to be your own manager, finding yourself work, or you don't have food or rent money.
Yeah.
And if that weren't the case, I would do most of the stuff I do for fun. Maybe not the cleaning houses, but I might still do that if people give me food or something. I don't know. It's just or if it was a communal living situation.
Yeah.
Yeah, in the society that we have right now, the labor of finding work and you surviving is placed on you, the individual. And that's a lot of pressure on you, because oftentimes you view it as life or death, or in most cases in first world countries, success or failure.
Right.
Whereas in most capitalist alternatives, we attempt to find a way to place that burden on all of us to help each other, because for some people it's actually not as hard of a burden to figure out what has to be done societally for them. And so those people are the sort of people that would aid in a society like that. We just haven't found the structure that would be least corruptible.
Well, one of the things that's been suggested and almost always poo-pooed is the idea of a guaranteed basic income, where you have that, and then people can do whatever they need to do without the pressure of having it have to meet their financial needs. You do what you need to do, and you're going to get that basic income regardless. it gives you the freedom to kind of engage in the sort of economy, the sort of gig economy that you're talking about, even at a part-time.
For the sake of clarification,
Go ahead.
I apologize.
No, okay. I'm going to say the only difficulty with universal basic income, from my perspective, is that in order for it to exist, you have to be producing surplus in a traditional capitalist way, in order to tax corporations that are profitable and individuals, and redistribute in the surplus that's generated through capitalist production. So because of that, you'll then need to maintain a class of people who have nothing to sell but their labor. And I think we're all kind of thinking about this in terms of there still being a class of people who have nothing to sell but their labor, and trying to imagine production that isn't a matter of selling your labor power, but is done cooperatively and perhaps democratically, is what Paracon was about, because it was saying people will do the work that they themselves decide needs to be done for the community, and they'll do it based on their abilities. And so then the political problem about that is taken out of the hands of people and put into the hands of a computer in the Paracon notion. Basic income, universal basic income works really well. I think would work great in a society which is affluent,
Right.
and successful, and doesn't have a gigantic military budget. But that, capitalism goes in cycles, and eventually universal basic income would be challenged just the way all social welfare programs or all social programs are challenged when there's an economic crisis, which is inevitably going to come. So there's two reasons I'm, as an anti-capitalist, not thrilled about universal basic income. But if we imagine that we can't get beyond capitalism, and that changes, how critical I am of that notion. And I think, like every 4 years or every 2 years, the Marxist in me dies as I go to the ballot box and decide in very realistic ways today.
We had started off this conversation discussing how there's a divide in the left because we can't seem to get along on what happens post-revolution. Am I getting this right? I feel like this is being way overcomplicated than it really is. I mean, like, we're saying that whoa, we need to back things up because we're too afraid to critique each other. There's a lack of a creative method of critique, as you said. But to me, democracy couldn't be more simple. I mean, and maybe I'm just like, take this with a grain of salt. I'm quite literally a high school dropout. But I mean, what legitimate movement to actually sit down and come together as a working class body has been made in order to implement true democracy in our economy, in the way that we divide our labor, the way that we reproduce. I mean, to me, full democracy means, or what is the method of voting that we use in the DSA? Consensus voting, right? A consensus voting process where everyone can have their opinions, where they can state it, and if it doesn't go well, then we just move on. Essentially what I'm trying to say is we're too afraid to be offended, but we have the right to be offended, and we just need to get over this so that we can simply open up dialogue and talk about how we function as an economy, as we function as a working class.
I think one of the problems is the problem of scale. I mean, because you do have, interesting examples of companies that are employee-owned companies that don't function with a CEO and a board of directors, and so on. But they're truly, run by the collective, the laborers. But I think that becomes difficult when you're trying to manage something larger than that. And that's one of the questions that I have is how do you scale that up without, at least inadvertently, creating a hierarchy and all of
Well,
that.
it's a lot easier to generate data than it is to manage it. Much more so managing people. And the problem with scale, I think, is the hub of the issue.
May I respond to that?
Yes,
so, I mean, the issue that I see in terms of how democracy functions in our nation is we have like this pyramid structure, right? Where we take like the opinions of the masses and then we like reduce it, and it comes to like this figurehead sort of structure where our opinion are taken into consideration as opposed to like the will of the people is the law. My solution to this is we just flip the pyramid around where we only vote on things that concern us. For example, I mean, like a factory that produces, we'll use Adam Smith's example of the pins, right? Okay, so we have a pin factory, right? And we have issues to, whatever they're talking about. I mean, if it affects the pin factory, then that's where democracy occurs. That's where the voting process happens. But if we're talking about a pin factory and like a shoe factory and it affects both of these, then we take randomly selected bureaucrats, maybe not even bureaucrats representatives. I don't even know it should be random. But I mean, if we just take representatives from these and like have them vote on the issues that concern them, then I mean, do you see the reverse pyramid structure that I'm talking about? It becomes very hard for politicians to be corrupt in that if we have it in a reverse pyramid structure, I mean, if we have, I wish I had like something I could draw with. If we have a corrupt politician at this point of the pyramid, it doesn't really matter because we have representatives representing like it's hard to get my thoughts out.
No, I think this is helpful. So, and one of the things that I'm really interested in as someone who's like kind of in the DSA, but also like these other things as well, it's like the question of how democratic a viable post-capitalism would have to be, or even if because the thing is like, let's just say that we became a full direct democracy, which there's different ways that could be possible. But even if it was the case, would we still be capitalists? And would the polis, or the majority, understand, for instance, how surplus labor is exploited? Or would it just be? I mean, would it become very privileged countries having very direct democracy, have a lot of say in how resources get distributed or allocated, but at the same time you still have these developed countries that are parasitical or on the developing world.
Well, are you really talking about what kind of granularity do you want for direct democracy? How tight the feedback loop is, how tight the OODA loop is. Observe, orient, decide, act. And it becomes much more cumbersome the bigger it gets. So it's a matter of design, algorithms.
Right. And whenever we're talking about like forms of organization, it's easy to conflate. There's so many different like levels and layers and ways of thinking about these things. So you can talk about like community organization of a small community. But I think what usually goes undiscussed is the fact that we have nation states, right? Yeah. And so it's like you can't change just your community if it's sort of under this larger umbrella. And the fact that the umbrella like expands out to the entire globe, right? I mean, I don't know, revolution has to be global, or the change that we're looking for in social order has to be global, because so long as there are nation states that are competing for, like, let's say resources or power or whatever, as long as there's that threat of war, like everyone's hands are tied. Like all the nations, their hands are all tied because there's, I don't know, it's not an environment in which you can just sort of change one. Like, let's say you're with a bunch of, like, there's all these predatory individuals, like, there's a gang of, like, bad guys in a movie, right? And one of them tries to, do something nice or tries to be, like, compassionate or giving. Well, you're with a bunch of people who are going to take advantage of you, so it just would never work out.
Yeah, I think I find that comes into the question of centralization versus decentralization, wherein on a global scale, centralization is an extremely powerful tool. We already know that. Authoritarianism is efficient, but our critique of it is that it's inhumane quite often.
If all you have is a hammer, everything is an axe.
Yeah. But what we find with these powerful, parasitic, predatory individuals is that they find these power structures and they're able to use them, and that's how they take advantage of people. So oftentimes our critique of direct democracy is, what if we have this extremely charismatic individual who rallies the people behind him? But that happens under a representative form of government that isn't directly democratic, with representation, and it gives them formal power. Whereas in a democratic, fully democratic society, the only power they have is how much people like them. And oftentimes people attempt to burden advocates of more democracy with issues akin to that, that are often easily as corruptible in literally any other system, because we're social beings. So obviously the more powerful you are, the more force you have. And there's different kinds of force. There's social force, there's emotional force, and there's brute force. The powerful individuals are the ones who've learned how to wield all of those. So what we as advocates of democracy often find ourselves faced with is critiques, not just from ourselves trying to figure out what our alternative is, but also from the right and from the center and from others within the left, is how we manage this organization in a way that won't revert exactly back to what we had attempted to avoid. Because people are easily able to manipulate power in structures like that.
Well, and I think part of the issue is too, you have those that are naturally have natural leadership abilities or have charisma or whatever are going to, regardless of the system, they're going to rise up to be leaders.
And they're not all sociopaths, but yes.
So I think
just to finish that, and another thing that is kind of a natural part of, as you're talking about, we're social animals and so on, and is the kind of the impetus toward factionalism, and that is the idea that that we're all created equal and we all should be working together in an equal way is a very abstract notion, but factionalism and tribalism and all of the cliques, whatever you want to call it, that naturally develop out of human social relationships always tend to break down those kinds of things. So whatever, and I don't have any kind of answer here. All I'm saying is that whatever kind of larger system that you want to come up with, it has to be able to, to deal with those natural kinds of impulses in human.
So I think it's really important
human social
to mention, to point out that the problems that you're talking about, say the problem of tribalism and corruption, or group affinity is a positive way to put it. Those are problems that capitalism is really good at overcoming. The capitalist system organizes people together across tribal categories. It brings the world together. It's made an international order, and it does so in the name of with the aim of mass production. So we're brought together as strangers in a production process at work to create projects and products and commodities with the aim of not serving any particular tribe or group or even our own needs, but simply with the aim of producing a profit through production for the capitalist class. Even without the capitalist class, we would still could have capitalism if we held on to that aim of creating a surplus through production. We want to overcome capitalism. We want to get beyond it. On the other hand, some of the problems that we are posing for ourselves are problems that are being solved currently by the capitalist system. You know, capitalism replaces bullets with money, which is not such a horrible thing.
Well,
So
I don't.
the other thing I want to point out is that we are tending to think about this in terms of corruption and politics and making sure that people act in fair and honest and cooperative and egalitarian way. Capitalism, okay, in Marx's book Capital, one of the things he does is he grants all of the propagandists every assertion they make to see what the consequences of living under a capitalist system might be. In other words, no one's cheating anyone else. Everyone's free in the marketplace. All the laws are abided by. People are as fair as they can be. Capitalism operating the way it claims to. And then you see that it's riven with contradictions and crisis as a structure, not because people cheat,
Right.
not because there are bad politicians, but because of the very logic of capital accumulation itself. And so those are just two things I'm pointing out to try to redirect us towards capitalism and away from, I guess I'm not bad, the nation state. I mean, the nation state is something that we would probably do without under true communism. I feel like if we got rid of capitalism, that we would find that the nation state couldn't even fund itself. It would have. So anyway.
So I guess that's, and also part of the stuff that you guys are talking about with like human nature. I think that's also a huge part of why we need a new civilization, more so than we need to think of like. So, for example, I kind of always take Hannah Arendt as my guide star because I love the way she wrote political theory, because unlike most political theorists before her, she didn't try to propose a new system, right? She didn't try to lay it out. And she and other theorists have said it's very arrogant to assume that we can just lay out a system that works.
Yeah.
And what she's trying to do is foster people's thinking and their understanding of, let's say, these contradictions of society at this point, because it's not about finding a template that we can apply by force. I think the main project is getting people to understand. It's almost like it's a scientific project in a sense, but not scientific in the sense that we have to have all this objective knowledge that, well, we don't know what it could be used for. We just gather all the knowledge, which is why science is so easily corruptible by capitalism or because let's fund this. You can get. It's just there's no aim for the knowledge that's gathered. But if we're understanding, the more we look at the world and understand its, I guess, actual mechanisms, right, of let's say the natural world, of human societies, and the less we rely on these sort of common sense reductions people will be greedy, or their sociopaths will take charge of a crowd, blah, blah, blah. We can look at the conditions under which those things arise and then try to create conditions together that don't facilitate those things. And that doesn't mean there will never be, if we can somehow organize ourselves socially differently and think about ourselves differently and think about the world differently, that there will never ever be any problems. It just means it shuts down questioning to say that well, this is just a fact of the matter. And I'm not against facts. I'm just saying that you can always refine them, right, and reformulate and rearrange them. And so I think that, Marx analyzing the very logic of capital instead of just acceding this well, it's bad because greedy people can exploit it. It's how does it logically, structurally function, and where are those contradictions? And then you look at those contradictions to unravel where did this system come from and how could we possibly move beyond it, or what we have to understand it basically before we demolish things. That's
there has to be, I think, a crisis of reproduction worldwide, because the system is so flexible about responding globally and even in nation states, that there needs to be a crisis of reproduction. Usually it's happened at the periphery. It needs to happen at the center. And this intricate network of global network of banking where a little storefront in Boise, Idaho is connected to China and to South Korea and to Malaysia. I mean, it's just staggering the intricate level of harmony about how this system works. And there would have to be a crisis to really change the mode of production. That would, it would not be a plan. It would probably be a response to a practical response to a crisis of reproduction that, you know, globally it would probably be authoritarian. There would be some kind of imposed authoritarian solution. It might be something where there's a transition from something from exchange value to use value just for the sheer sake of survival. And hopefully at the nation state level and at local levels, there could be some kind of direct democracy to act as a countervailing force. But this whole thing about the global nature of the system, the Soviet Union showed that it's hard to have socialism in one country. It's really hard to have socialism in one town, socialism in one business. And I just really think that some kind of intense worldwide crisis is the way the mode of production is going to change. Otherwise, we're going to be.
Why didn't 2008 do it? I mean, we just had. I mean, I guess it was a while ago now, 10 years. I can't believe it. But why wasn't 2008 the crisis that brought in a major change, you know, away from capitalism? Are you looking at an ecological crisis or?
Going to be an ecological crisis.
Yeah, I think that's going to be the key thing.
I think the reason that 2008 wasn't the crisis that caused it was, well, first off, it wasn't as global as it needs to be. While it was an issue for us in first world countries and other developing countries, in poor places where people are already starving, it changed almost nothing for them in the first place. So they had no incentive to rise up with anyone who would have suffered in the crisis in 2008. Not to mention, liberalism has this amazing ability to adapt to crises and hide the contradictions that it has and hide the crises that it's going to have. It adapts so well, it's like a cancer that instead of attempting to solve the issues at the root of the problem, it patches the wounds. And it's often in the socialist perspective that eventually it's going to run out of patches, or the raft that liberalism floats on is just going to be made entirely of patches.
It'll have a kernel panic.
Yeah. Which is which is the panic that we would be looking at in the case of great social change in the first place.
I wanted to tie this back to the pretty much one of the last pages of the book, page 79, with Zizek as my segue, because Badiou and Zizek are known as being two of the leading anti-capitalist thinkers on the left right now. And Zizek, I think it was this year or last year, it was Brian who shared the video with me. Put this lecture out. I think it's called In Defense of a Bureaucratic Socialism, or something like that. And the idea that he posits there is, like, he says, that David Graeber style of localist direct democracy where you have to get together on a weekly basis and organize and delegate and decide and all these things. It sounds exhausting to him. And if it sounds exhausting to him, he doesn't really imagine most other people are going to want to be on board with it. And he says that any replacement for capitalism is going to have to be able to be so efficient that it operates in the background. And I thought that ties in well with what Fisher's saying Badiou says on 79, where he's also saying that an effective anti-capitalism must an effective anti-capitalism must be a rival to capital, not a reaction to it.
Yeah.
Right. So,
Bless you.
Yeah.
Right.
And so what I was wondering about, and this was a question that Sam Wanacott, who's joining us there with the mustache, brought up, and it became a real question while reading this book, was what are the necessary and sufficient conditions for capitalism in the first place? Because when Fisher talks about it, he talks about it as this atmospheric force that can adjust to anything. But I mean, if that's the case, then we can't ever know if we did get out of it, or if we have provided something that would be a rival to it. And I'm wondering if you've thought about that.
Me? Yeah. I have thought about it a little bit. I just wrote a book called Bash Bash Revolution. And my problem is when I think about the problem, I kind of tend to get overwhelmed. So I start being a little silly. And so I decided that the way to replace capitalism was to replace it with augmented reality games, like Pokemon Go. So people would work because they were playing a game. It was something they liked doing. And what was produced through their work would be more games to play. And that the real competition was, who was going to be the coolest worker. In other words, get the high score at the factory. So on. Of course, the book I wrote, dystopian novel, but I want to underline the idea that if we are reacting to capitalism, we're often doing its dirty work for it. I think, again, this idea of gig economy kind of falls in line. I mean, that doesn't really come from the left, but there's a certain ethos that is sort of leftist that's behind it. That we're all going to be creators. We're all going to be expressing our true inner nature. We're all going to do work that we find personally rewarding, and we're all going to put the profit motive aside and cooperate through networks, and and that's the gig economy, right? And that's what capital ended up using to solve some of its problems. So I agree that we need to think about something that would compete with capitalism fundamentally, rather than react to this and that bad thing about capitalism. And the worst thing in the world to me, job where at the end of a shift, I was required to sit in a 4-hour meeting to decide things like who got hired and who was going to be docked in pay or some way disciplined, what was going to be produced, what our quotas are going to be. I mean, to be your own boss is a nightmare in that way. I want to go home and have a beer afterward.
The trouble with socialism is it takes up too many evenings.
Right. Well, that's not. I mean, the problem with worker co-ops under capitalism is it takes up too many evenings. The problem of self-management under capitalism is it takes up too many meetings. It's got too many meetings and too many evenings, and it does. And it's not. It's exhausting. I agree with Zizek. It's exhausting. But I mean, how many of you have had to work a job where you are called upon to sit in management style meetings in order to be able to participate in the decision making that went on in your own office and sort of create the rules that would then later be used to discipline your own work? I mean, I've had to do it. And the one thing I couldn't decide was not to participate, right? I mean, these were mandatory meetings that were democratically run where I got to say what I didn't like about the job and make my complaints and also suggest things for the future, but I couldn't not go. that was a fireable offense. So it didn't seem very liberating to me at the time.
Well, right, and I think creating something that can compete with capitalism means creating ways for people to live together, so that they don't have to necessarily participate in the economy fully. Right, so it's kind of like edging yourself out of something. And I know I know a lot of these reformulations, it's well, what isn't a reaction to capitalism, right? How can we actually create something that stands on its own? It would require you having a bunch of rich people who don't have to worry about anything and aren't mad about anything, and then just get together and make some cool stuff. I don't know. So because as long as anyone is experiencing these sorts of, I guess, feelings of alienation or having to struggle to survive. So, for example, you try to start an organization to explore potentials for living learning communities, but all the volunteers consistently have to drop out or are disappointments or just can't get the work done because they have full-time jobs. And so it's like, well, I don't know, like how do we move forward in creating this, competitive alternative? It's kind of like you have to have think tanks, but they can't just be like funded. Do they have to be funded by private donors? Like, how do you
Well, they don't. No, you could run, some sort of a Patreon account and fund a left-wing think tank
Policy project.
that way, for like the way Chapo Trap House is funded, right? That could be, but then
Right.
if you do that, then the problem will be for those people involved that you're creating an elite class of people who are being funded by all these different donors, and there'll be a lot of political pressure on them to come up with something that everyone wants to hear, and also align with some sort of real politics in the moment. If you're going to have a think tank for a revolutionary project, I don't know. There's something contradictory about the term institution for that in a way, but I'm just like you now. I'm just like frustrated at the prospect. I'm all for the left-wing think tanks. I think that's a good thing. I'm talking too much because I'm on the center screen.
I guess.
Why would an institution be hypocritical? It wouldn't. I mean, are we like allowing for power structures to exist so that people could become corrupt?
Well, no, I mean, power structure, like a system or an institution doesn't necessarily have to be bad. Like, right? I think that creating institutions that people could trust and actually did want to turn to for solutions or for models for living is important. The problem is that no matter what you do, like, how do you escape the profit motive? Like, how do you escape it? And like, even nonprofits have to make a profit to put back into they have to make a profit to fund their charity or whatever. There's always like, it can go to different things, but that just like somebody's got to collect the money and then they can do with it, either what they want, because it's now, I don't know. And there's lots of different complicated structures, but that sort of.
It's not so much like being unethical. I'm talking too much. I'll let you guys talk.
No,
really.
I want to say that one thing. It's not so much even that it's an ethical problem, but just that funding a think tank, okay, this little group of people are intellectuals. They're going to be able to come up with ideas professionally, but not everyone's going to understand. It's an elite institution. And okay, that's fine. I'm not even against that, on principle necessarily, but then to turn around and crowdfund it, which would probably be the only way to do it other than getting capitalists to fund you, there's a contradiction, because you're saying, trust us. We're gonna write things that maybe you won't like at first blush, but we're smart people. Fund us, and we're gonna be putting out these position papers and developing a think tank to do what? To fund what political? To work through what political project? I mean, most think tanks are aligned with really existing parties, right? So you have a think tank like the Rand Corporation or whatever that's working on ideas for the Republican Party. I think we have to have a party and then think tanks around that, maybe. Just if we want think tanks. I'm not necessarily parties, or I'm saying it's tricky. I mean, the problem is every existing institution operates in the existing society, which we're trying to knock the foundation out from under. And it's hard.
Right, you either get accused of like being outside of it and being sort of like in a commune utopia where you're not doing anything, or participating too much in the system and being corrupted by it. And it's like, is there a third option? Yeah. And I guess it's like you have to find the margins of that society where it doesn't have as much control or legibility and try to like work from there. And like, it's kind of like you have to think like you're creating a virus that's going to kind of like infiltrate back in. You know what I mean? Yeah. Like that's how they get new strains of crops, or they used to, is like letting two fields of like two different varieties of something just sort of mingle together at the border, right, and create new strains of things. And so I feel like maybe we have to think more like that. I don't know where these border spaces are, but
obviously, Marx was trying to leverage the untapped power of the working class. They're the workers. But one of the things that I wanted to ask, following back up on Dave's reading of that little quote about capitalism needing a rival and not just resistance or reaction to it. Many of the apologists for capitalism will say the reason why capitalism, in particular free market capitalism, works is because it is simply a function of an expression of human nature and human acquisitiveness and all of those things. And so that's why we have it, because it is just it
has the defects of its virtues.
Yes, not to put too fine a point on it, but if there's going to be something that is going to rise up to be a revival, because we've also offered the critique, part of the problem with capitalism is it seems to be inhumane, right, and not sustainable. So how do you have a rival then that is also, because it would have to be every bit as much an expression of human nature as capitalism is, to be a true rival to it? Yeah.
I believe that human nature is a fallacy that the bourgeois appeal to as a means to defend the prevailing system. The material conditions of society is what's going to dictate human nature. I mean, because we are put against our fellow worker in the factory setting or just like any setting under capitalism, it is what causes this greedy, selfish nature for us to be put against each other, and to allow these individuals to rise up as corrupt psychopaths. What my response to this and how we challenge capitalism as like a means to as you said, we need something that can actually compete with capitalism is, well, capitalism is going to die within 100 years. This is my opinion. It's going to die within 100 years. It's just simply a matter of whether humanity is going to die with it. I mean, our mode of production that we have, we're told to recycle, we're told to practice these things that can help the environment, but as workers, what power do we have to change the mode of production that like the bourgeois are having with like the production of plastic and stuff?
Right.
I mean, we are in this system for trying to survive. We have no means to escape this destructive method of production with like the uses of petroleum products and such. And what we're seeing is global devastation. I mean, people don't seem to understand that climate change is exponential. I mean, it's not linear, exponential. We may have like a bad winter one year, but the next year we couldn't get out of our house because there's too much snow, right? Every mass extinction has been correlated to the bleaching of the coral reefs. What are we seeing right now? The bleaching of the coral reefs. So my response to this, what we need to do to respond to capitalism is, I will flat out say, I think we need communism. And I think that it can compete with capitalism because it is the only system that will save humanity from extinction. I mean, what kind of system where automation is a bad thing, right? I mean, we have automation stealing jobs, right? Why is that a bad thing? Why can't we use that to liberate ourselves and to like express more fully the things that we want to do, have a culture of greater art and stuff like that? Mm-hmm. And that's not to say that we're going to be lazy. That's not to say that we're just going to rely on robots to take care of our work. But I mean, this idea that it's human nature to be greedy and like people will just like rely off of like a welfare state, that's a complete fallacy. I mean, people will work to survive. People, this competition that we see.
I think that it says less than it thinks it does too. Like, it may be in human nature to be greedy, but greedy for what and in what ways? I mean, I think the truth is it's in human nature to want to seek status within a social group.
I think regarding human nature,
is like how you get status, social group changes.
Yeah, I think within
my own lifetime. So, like, people are greedy, but greedy for what kinds of things? That depends on how things are organized and what's produced and all of that. No one was greedy for iPhones. Phones were created, obviously, and that's sort of a trivial thing to say, but also no one was greedy to be an entrepreneur when absolute monarchies were running the world, and they were greedy to be close to the king. So we could have greedy people who are greedy in better ways.
That's true. I think building off of that, I have two personal views on the existence or non-existence of human nature. The first is that human simply doesn't exist, and that's a really simplistic view and a little bit hard to prove. But the second one, and probably the most likely to be the most true, is that human nature not only exists, but it's organic and dynamic, rather than the static view that the bourgeoisie attempt to place on it, that this is the way that things are, so it must have been the way that things always have been and always will be, as if the word nature itself was unchanging, which is entirely the opposite of what happened. Nature we see is constantly changing. That's why we find it so, that's why we find it so wondrous. Even like, even in a Christian perspective, I come from an ex-Christian background. People don't view the existence of God as static. They view the existence of God within time as static, but not God's perception of what ought to be. When the flood came, at least in the Christian belief, even in that belief, it seems completely unjustifiable to say that nature itself was static when all of things that we see in nature do change. Even like, we can see that the most basic laws of physics tend to stay true, but when we find these exceptions, like closer towards the center of black holes, the laws of time and gravity seem to warp. Not to mention the fact that electrons can be found to disappear and reappear somewhere else simply just because we can't we can't view their location and velocity at the exact same time. All of these things about nature point towards the exact opposite. And this is just simply because it's easier for the current system to say that the current system is what is than to say that any other system can be. It's just easier argumentation on the status quo to say that the status quo is law.
Yeah. And I wanted to jump in really quick. Just say we've got about 12 minutes left, and it would be great if anybody who hasn't had a chance to talk yet. I know I've said a lot. I've got more questions, but hey, I hope other people will pose some.
Well, to quote Ron Ziegelberger 3, no one misses capitalism, but everyone knew what the rules were. And he was referring to the Cold War. And if we're trying to envision a new era, we don't know what the rules are yet. The actual rules. Who has power, who does what, to whom, with what.
Well, Marx said, capitalism means it melts into thin air or something along those lines. So I feel like capitalism has developed to a point now where as soon as you think you know what your role is, that role is already obsolete.
Yeah.
So like, you think you're a YouTuber. Well, YouTube's just about to crash, say, as soon as you figure that out or something. You think you're a podcaster, this is all talking about my crap, I guess, or you're a publisher of books and no one reads them anymore. So, yeah, I don't know. I think, go ahead.
I just said I read one of your books.
It's a throwback, retrograde.
Yeah.
But no, I feel like it's sort of funny, like back to capitalist realism. It's funny to see Mark Fisher, as you read his book, complain about how nothing changes, and then in the next chapter or sometimes the next paragraph, complain about what has changed.
Yeah.
So the move from Fordism to a post-Fordist society, and the move from a disciplinary society to a control society. That's a change that he recognizes, and that has occurred, that he doesn't particularly like, even though he isn't like wanting to celebrate Fordism or the nuclear family for that matter. He mourns its passing in this book, and students come in for a real kicking. in in capitalist realism, probably deservedly so. But yeah, it's because it's very consistent and it remains the same on one level, and it's constantly innovating and shifting around on the other. On the level of appearance, it's constantly shifting, but on the foundational level, it just keeps reproducing its same social process over and over again.
So I think sometimes you see people in theory sort of taking one principle and making it the demon, right? So like hierarchy is evil, period, no matter what, we have to get rid of it. And then it's like, oh, cool, well, now we're going to have a rhizomatic horizontal neoliberal capitalism. Like,
Yeah.
And so I think that taking on principle this idea that change or, I don't know, unchangingness are bad doesn't do us any good. What we have to look at is what is changing, what's not changing, right? So it's not all just like about the dynamic flux of existence, like, and get with it, and like whatever. No, no, but I'm saying like some people seem to like, even Foucault like thought that this would be a site of sort of like resistance to embrace like this multiplicity and change and like so on and so forth, but it's really easily co-opted. And so instead of embracing a principle that we can run our society by, I think we need to re-examine the way we think in like, here's our central principle, and like everything relies on this, and we need to like look more specifically at mechanisms. Like, for example, the sort of accumulation that's predicated on the exploitation of workers hasn't changed. The form that that it's taken has changed, right? But there's some sort of essence that's still there, or you know, alienation hasn't changed. In fact, well, it has changed. It's gotten worse. But so I guess I'm just saying, like, we need to be way more specific and careful in the way we talk, and it's really easy as thinkers to boil things down to principles because it's very easy to see a pattern and extract it. But so I think it's valid for Fisher to be upset about things staying the same and them changing in bad ways, because it's not the right thing that changed.
This would be I'd be kicking myself later if I didn't bring this up. So Mark Fisher came out of CCRU, knew Nick Land, right? And accelerationism kind of embraces this idea of capitalism that's rhizomatic and it's amorphous and it's adaptable and kind of just goes all in on speeding up the processes and the contradictions, and then we can see how that's been co-opted by the alt-right in various sectors, and then there's been different left-wing responses and adaptations that I've not kept up with, and I don't know about everyone here, but I'm curious about where you're at following all of that, and if
I don't really fully understand Nick Land's work. I mean, from my understanding, he's gone full reactionary. That's my understanding, that over the process of his work, he shifted from the left to the far right. But it's, you know, it's hard for me to make heads or tails out of what he actually says. So, and I haven't read him. I've heard rumor of some of the, like, he's embraced, but I haven't read it directly. But he certainly seems to be fully within the realm of capitalist realism when he writes. That what he exposes, I think, is how a Deleuzian celebration of flux can be completely right wing, and so I think that's
Fascism action. Exactly.
Yeah. So I think that it would be really worthwhile to look at the milieu that Fisher came from again, and because it's a really interesting one. The first time I ever heard about the Situationists was when I read Sadie Plant's book, The Most Radical Gesture. I was about 20 years old. It was a long time ago now, unfortunately. And I came across her book, just could like the title and the artwork on the cover, and read this very kind of esoteric philosophy book about the Situationists. And she was a co-founder of the Cybernetic, or whatever that organization was called that Nick Lain and Mark Fisher were part of as well. And they were just a very interesting group of radical thinkers, and their trajectories are worth examining, and they're different. Like, I haven't heard about Sadie Plant in probably over a decade. But yeah, I think I think that there are strains of thought that need to be overcome in that whole milieu, and there are others that need to be embraced more fully. I think Mark Fisher's death is a real tragedy because London, right past his biggest success, he needed to write about capitalism again, and you know, I kind of miss him for that. I wish he was still here to keep developing.
Well, I wonder, and I know we want to wrap up.
A downer thing.
This is a big question, but there seems to be a contradiction between the apparent ability of capital to be self-valorizing, that you just move numbers from one column to another, and the right people make all the money they need to buy the armies and the politicians to keep the system in place. And then, you know, then you have the classic labor theory of value that you have to somebody has to finally do something. You have to, you know, labor actually creates value. The system seems to be going to a place where we're going to be shedding the need for human labor, you know, whether it's, you want to say it's congealed labor in machines or what. I just wonder what the effect is going to be with fewer and fewer people actually needing to do something to get from today to tomorrow. I wonder if there's some transubstantiational aspect to capitalism where there might be a transformation to something that's actually different. I'm not the person to figure that out, but that sure would be nice if there was some kind of Hegelian thing going on there.
I fully embrace the labor theory of value. I don't know if that's well known. Probably, I go on and on about it. So I tend to think that what happens when we get too much automation, in other words, from the capitalist point of view, or within capitalism, too much automation, is that the economies that are really automated go into crisis because of rate of profit, and then there's, you know, creative destruction of some sort of or another, and there's reinvestment. And as far as unemployment, you know, mass death is not a problem for capitalism. It's just an adjustment in the labor pool, and it, you know, so I don't think that unemployment itself will drive a terminal crisis for capitalism, and I don't think automation will either. I think there are countervailing forces working against full automation, and as long as we've got capitalism, that will hold. But I'm not sure. I mean, I could be wrong about that because there's so much automation now. I think that what we should expect from automation is unemployment and eventual economic crisis, which is awful, and then which will, you know, help capitalism right itself, or the world economy right itself, kind of out of the depression. But that's a very orthodox Marxist and sort of pessimistic perspective, but happens to be the one I think is correct.
Does anybody have any closing questions or thoughts? You're in Oregon right now?
Yeah.
Yeah. So for those who didn't know, like Douglas lives in New York City right now, right?
I live in Portland.
Oh, you live in? You do
Portland.
live in? Oh, okay. We should just had you drive.
I visit New York City. I visit New York City about once a year. I was just in Paris for the holiday, but yeah, I live in Portland, Oregon.
Oh, I didn't know you were based there. It's fantastic.
Yeah, I'd love to live in New York, but it's too expensive. I love Portland too. Have you been to Portland? Who's been to Portland?
Many times.
Yeah. So I have a closing question for everyone in the room. What do Do you think that in another 10 years, people are still going to be reading Capitalist Realism? It's been 10 almost.
If there are people.
This book.
And if there's capitalism.
There are books and people. There's human society.
I think as long as people are experiencing the dissonance and are experiencing the sort of dehumanizing or inhuman aspects, and they're still seeing the inevitable crash coming because of unsustainability. I mean, either that's eventually going to actually happen, or people are going to still be worrying about it, one or the other.
I mean, it's also become a buzzword because of people like Jody Dean, Nancy Fraser, David Hart, Slavoj Žižek, so like all of these big thinkers using it, and anyone who follows them or tries to engage in that body of work. This is, I mean, you're used to tomes, right, that are extremely difficult, and it's like, oh well, I can read this thing in an afternoon, and it's like me, it's short, accessible, and enjoyable. Had to get that one in there.
How long did you think about that?
Just now.
Well, good. I mean, I just think that it's very much it's an odd book because it's very much of its time. Actually, Fisher talked about this. He said he was writing the book right before the economic crisis, and he had to sort of change it a little bit of the last decade. And I just wonder what's coming next, and will we still be in? I hope that this book will help us write the next book. Right? I hope someone comes along to write the next Capitalist Realism that can put this current moment in context, as well as this book did for the last decade or so. But I do think that you're right; it will still be read. But it also definitely seems to be of its moment, and I don't know. Maybe Capital was, that was of its moment too. So we'll see. But I think Trump. I'll just say this: I think the election of Trump really changes, or at least for me, it changed my approach to understanding neoliberalism. And you could be completely anti-neoliberal and not be worth anything at all. The alt-right is anti-neoliberal. Steve Bannon is against the neoliberal project. Not our friends, these people not on the right side.
Authoritarian state capitalism is also not neoliberalism.
I actually wanted to say, we listened to, was it Nancy Fraser listening to that video? So Nancy Fraser had this really interesting talk about, it wasn't necessarily, I don't know if she used the word intersectionality, but it's basically we have to look at not just like economic problems, but we also have to look at all these other isms and problems and how they're all sort of interrelated, and in like how they tie together and function together to support each other. And I think, maybe after the election of Trump, that becomes really apparent that you can't just say, well, we'll get rid of this one and it'll be fine, because it's, I don't know. I feel like it's not like these things are always a package deal, but they're interrelated. Like, the racism, the sexism, the sort of some of the economic ideas about empire, or about like, oh, I earned all my money. All of $1 million.
Every capitalist says that, right? every capitalist says, I earned all my money and I'm where I'm at because of the meritocracy.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Well,
I think you're right.
Yes. Questioning
Except for the nephew with the co-brother.
With his shirts.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, I just think you're right. I think that we do need to be looking at, I think that we need to look at capitalism as capitalism. I think everyone should read Marx. That's it. And then that will help us understand all these other problems like racism and sexism, like try to explain what, like, if you look at capitalism as capitalism, then you start to look at the problems in society as being also functional, and understand that when these problems stop being functional, they go away to a large extent. So, like, what role does sexism play in society today? What is it good for? And it, I don't think it really serves capital very well in the West right now, but it probably is doing wonders in some parts of the developing world as far as, managing and disciplining the process of primitive accumulation.
Right.
I think it's does wonders in the Western world.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that the term is overused or misunderstood, like most terms are, because of, I don't know, the internet or whatever. But there's like sort of a feminist turn to looking at emotional labor, which it originally was, that term was used in an economic analysis of how like care workers and customer service support and other sort of managerial positions had to deny their own emotions, and how it had this impact on their mental health, because they have to be managing not just objects, right, and systems. It's not like you're just a factory worker and you can like cuss and like do whatever while you're, or I don't know. So it's like you have to internalize the system and make sure everybody's happy. And women still do that, like at home, or even in what they call pink collar work, right, which is largely female, such as caregiving and such. And a lot of that stuff has been unpaid for a great deal of our history, and we see a lot of the sort of economization of a lot of those forms of labor. I mean, we have apps where people get paid to cuddle now, even, right? And like, so there's this sort of like
money involved with that.
Because some people can't get the
Everything
service.
everything can be monetized.
Everything can be commodified, but there's still this. I don't think that commodification is exactly the answer. It's not that everyone. It's not like you should have to pay every woman in your life for her unpaid emotional labor. It's just like we have to recognize how.
Yeah, that would be bad. Yeah, that's something every woman is saying, I demand to be treated like a prostitute, is not liberatory, right? Sorry, I couldn't help it, but yes, but on the other hand, you're right. I don't know though how to quantify. I guess maybe this is the limits of Marx. I don't know how to quantify or fit the notion of emotional labor or labor that's truly creative. Like even like if you're an advertising worker and you're designing a new ad, I don't think that actually fits into the kind of labor process that Marx described. So these
sorry.
Go ahead. No, you go ahead.
What I was going to say is that I think we can look at those forms of labor and sort of see the social origins of labor itself, right? It's some forms of labor are way easier to commodify. Some forms of commodities are easier to commodify, and other things just like, how do you quantify that? And seeing how we've had to quantify everything to sort of expand markets infinitely, I don't know. I don't think that's a hard concept for people to understand, because everybody seems to be pretty weirded out by some of the things that get commodified now, or people understand that there are all these sorts of unpaid labor that go on all the time, and so it's like, can't we trace that back to see how labor has been itself commodified,
right,
in all its forms?
That's why I like that you brought up primitive accumulation, because Nancy Fraser's point in that talk is really it's about primitive accumulation. It's that whole section in Das Kapital pretty much just it could just have a little bit extra there about how capital presumes a primitive accumulation of the labor of the women at the woman at the home, the mother, the caretaker, because at that point in society that was a given, and then natural resources being there as standing reserve. Yeah, I think all this stuff is like really important to have conversations about and in depth. The great thing about Capitalist Realism is the book is that it gets people to start really trying to define their terms and figure out what do we mean by capitalism, what makes sense within a critique of capitalism. When are we critiquing older social forms that are still lingering around, patriarchal
institutions still exist inside capitalism, but I don't think capitalism is inherently patriarchal. So I would just encourage, like, I'd love to join a conversation again, maybe in a couple of weeks, about some other text.
Yeah.
Like maybe a
Hey,
text
well,
about.
I'd love to have you on for a conversation
Yes,
about the ABCs of socialism.
Yeah.
Yay.
Yeah. Okay. Or how
Or
about,
something.
does anyone want to do one about wages for housework and just that whole movement of like
That would
how
be brilliant.
to about unpaid labor under capitalism?
Is that a book
Well, I know
or
it's
a
a movement.
topic?
It's a
Oh,
topic.
yeah.
But there's also essays.
There's probably some good articles out there.
That would be awesome.
Yeah.
Social reproduction.
Yeah.
Because it's something I should
Well,
learn more about and keep away from my wife.
What gets me about this world is that we start out as Hermione Granger, and then we're sorted into Slytherin. And
Oh.
I mean, that's an essentialist kind of argument, but it's one that I'm willing to live with right now. I don't want to be.
Did you just make a Harry Potter joke? Did I just hear a Harry
Oh, I
Potter
did.
joke there, or am I hallucinating about Slytherin?
No,
We think in terms of the categories of Harry Potter.
Well, yeah, it'd be great to be with you.
My battery's running out.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, this is a good spot, right?
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us. We'd love to do that. Take care. Did you push the end broadcast button? Thanks for joining us, Robert.
I don't know if he knew how to.
I don't know if he.
Should have told him.
There we go.
Oh.
I'm here. I was watching.
Cool.
Good to see you guys. I haven't even taken a shower. I haven't taken a shower yet.